From the Center for Agricultural Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, this is Nebraska Farmcast, and on this episode, we'll be looking more at creative strategies for farm and ranch succession and estate planning with Jessica Groskopf, an ag economist here at University of Nebraska-Lincoln. She's continued her series of articles looking at several of these methods with a new publication on gifting ownership of the farm or ranch business. She's joining me now to share insights on gifting shares, considerations for ownership transfer, and the importance of planning for both the current and future generations. Thanks for being here again, Jessica.
Thanks for having me, Ryan.
So, as we said, this latest article focuses on gifting shares or a percentage of the business as a means of business transition planning. So how could this work, and how easy is it really to carry out?
So this is a really interesting strategy, but the most important thing is that you have to have an entity structure that allows for the transfer of shares or changes in the percentage of ownership. So we're looking at farms and ranches that are set up as partnerships, LLCs, or corporations. And this is really a cool tool because you can use basically that entity as a gift to the lower generations. So as an older generation, which we're going to call the donor, I can gift that to my heirs, which we call the donee. So it's a really interesting plan if I have the right entity structure in place. And honestly, it is actually fairly easy, but I do need to emphasize this is not something you just decide to do. You do need a team of professionals behind you. And at the top of that list is a very talented attorney and a very knowledgeable tax professional who can help you know and understand what you need to be able to implement this strategy.
And what are some of the benefits to gifting ownership? What I should say, potential benefits for farm families?
So this is a really interesting strategy because to some extent it provides not just ownership, but potentially management decisions and income to that younger generation in a gradual way. So depending on how we set up this transfer, I could be slowly gifting a portion of my business to that younger generation, to that donee, and giving them that opportunity to learn the ropes while I'm still alive. It also creates that shift of income between the owner and the heir as well, right? So as that owner gets a little bit older, maybe they have some other assets that they can tap into and really allows that younger generation to grow that farm or that ranch business gradually over time.
Great. And in your article, you discuss both making this transition or this transfer during a donor's lifetime and then after that donor's death. So what are some things families should keep in mind when transferring ownership during the donor's lifetime?
Yeah, so first of all, if you're going to tackle or think about this type of transfer, you need to work with your financial team. You need to determine the liabilities associated with that business, the asset basis, and then the value of those shares or that percentage of the business. We can use two exclusions as we work through this. That's the annual gift tax exclusion and the lifetime gifting exclusion to make this transfer. So as we think about both sides, during life, there's a few things we need to consider. First is the management of that business. So how much of that management is being transferred with those shares? And that comes down to that decision making. If that donor, that older generation, still wants control or more control, we need to make sure that this isn't a large transfer all at once, because that might also be transferring that decision-making power. So we need to think about really, is this a small progressive gift? We're gifting a little bit each year, maybe 1% or 0.5% every year, or is it that large shift? And that depends on the farm or the ranch business. Along with that is the consideration of the transfer of income. So as that ownership percentage changes or that ownership of shares change, that's going to ripple through the business. So we really need to make sure that both the owners and the heirs maintain a viable standard of living. It's very, very important as we work through the transition process that both parties still have that viable standard of living. And so we have to think about, is that transfer of shares or ownership also transferring that income, and where is that comfortable mix? Now, the biggest disadvantage of gifting assets during life is the fact that the person receiving that gift, the donee, they lose the step up in basis. So that is a huge disadvantage. If that donee, let's say, sells an asset, they're going to go pay capital gains on that asset all the way back to the donor's basis, the person who gifted them that asset. So that's something that's important. It could have big tax implications as you're transferring, in this case, shares or percentage of ownership to a younger person, that if they have to turn around and sell something, that could be a huge disadvantage. You might be thinking, well, I'm never going to sell that item that was gifted to me or this business. But the reality is that life comes at us from different ways, so we need to be very aware of this disadvantage. The other side to that is there are advantages to gifting during life for the on-farm heir because they are building ownership within that business, and it provides them opportunities that they might not have otherwise, right? They can borrow against the business's equity, and they can do lots of interesting things now that they have ownership in this business. Another disadvantage that might be a risk, though, is with that ownership, that component of the business could be lost. It could be sold. It could also be seized by creditors. So if we're going to enter into this relationship, we have to think about the big, broad what ifs that come with it and maybe put into act some additional agreements that might mitigate some of that risk. So, for example, I might put in a buy-sell agreement that states that only a family member can buy or sell shares of that entity in order to help contain some of that risk.
So, how are tax implications and financial planning going to play into that decision to gift shares during life versus at death or after death?
Yeah, so we talked about the tax implications of losing the step up in basis while gifting shares while alive. However, if we wait to gift that business until death, that does a couple of different things. Number one, it allows those heirs to receive the step up in basis. So that's a big advantage. The other thing is it leaves that owner generation, which in the article we call the donor, in control while they're alive. It allows them to maintain that flexibility that we were discussing earlier in their estate plan. So as laws change, as the business changes, they can change their estate plan a little bit more because they have not gifted anything yet. However, that's a risk to the on-farm heir. So if I came back to the farm or the ranch business and I was told you will be compensated with a certain percentage of the business at my death, and it doesn't happen, right? It's not written into the estate plan. There's little to no recourse there. So that is a risk that the owner generation could change their mind on the estate plan and not do what they promised verbally to that on-farm or ranch heir. So that is a risk. So we like to see things in writing. There might be some possibility to make sure that it continues to be in writing. But again, you need to be talking with your lawyer and your accountant if that's why you're coming back to the farm or the ranch.
How about when it comes again to the importance of control and flexibility for the donor? Can you just elaborate on why that's crucial for a smooth transition and how it can be achieved?
Yeah. So again, that donor is that owner generation who's looking to transfer assets out of their name. And control is always kind of an interesting piece, right? So we talked a little bit about maintaining control of the finances and the decision making, but also we need to think about flexibility. Things are going to change either in their life or in the tax code that they need to be aware of. And when you are gifting, you are losing control of those assets. And in this case, what we're talking about is you're potentially losing control of those shares or of that percentage of the business. So if we're gifting during life, to some extent, we're losing that flexibility. Now, again, we might be able to put in some additional agreements that say if X happens, Y will happen. So again, that buy-sell agreement or something in that manner that would allow that control to be returned to the donor. But again, we've got to work with the attorney and with the tax accountant to make sure that it's still a true gift. So again, you have to think about this world a little bit more broadly than the perfect path you're imagining, because a lot of things can happen. And we've got to work with a really great team who says, something that is a potential risk is X, and here's how we can mitigate that risk, helping that donor really think about gifting, yet still maintaining some control and flexibility.
And then finally, we talk about this with almost seemingly all succession estate planning conversations, but you mention it here again in the article. How can families balance the interests of on-farm heirs with those of non-farm heirs when they're planning?
So this strategy is a really great strategy if you have on-farm and non-farm heirs, because depending on the business structure, when we're gifting shares or percentages of that business, we might have two different types of shares. We might have voting and non-voting shares. So traditionally in this kind of arrangement, we want that on-farm heir to have more of those management decisions. So that would be a scenario where we would gift the on-farm or on-ranch heir voting shares, management power, and that non-farm or non-ranch heir a non-voting share. So they still have ownership in the business, but they don't have day-to-day management decision making. So that's where this balance here in this strategy is very interesting and can be a way to work through. I want to treat my children more equally, right? But we still want that person who's in the dirt every day to be able to make the decisions on that operation without having to worry about their brothers or their sisters who live in LA or Chicago.
Great. Well, awesome information again from Jessica Groskopf. She's an agricultural economist with Nebraska Extension and the Center for Agricultural Profitability based in Scottsbluff, Nebraska. And you can find her new article on this, which is transferring ownership or ownership shares of the business, on our website at cap.unl.edu. And if you scroll to the bottom of that article, you'll also see links to the other, I believe at this point, other 3 articles in this series of ideas for estate and transition planning. So Jessica, thanks again for joining me.
Thanks, Ryan.
Nebraska Farmcast is a production of the Center for Agricultural Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. For the latest research-based information and education resources to manage your farm or ranch operation, visit our website at cap.unl.edu. That's cap.unl.edu.